Lorenzo Vidino, and I'm the director of the program on extremism at George Washington University. So on behalf of the program, it's my privilege to welcome everybody to today's event, Mosul and the Islamic State, Justice and the Future of Mosul 4 years on. 4 years ago, Mosul was formally liberated after having been under occupation by the Islamic State for 3 terrible years, in which the city became, together with Raqqa in Syria, a prestigious stronghold for the group. If the conquest of the city by the Islamic State had massive reverberations in Iraq, throughout the Middle East and worldwide, the biggest impact of its occupation was arguably felt by its residents, the 1.5 million Moslawis that lived under the brutal rule of the Islamic State. How did the city fall in the hands of the Islamic State? What was life inside ISIS-occupied Mosul? And what has happened over the last 4 years since its liberation? What has given hope to, and what has been a source of frustration for Moslawis? These are some of the questions we're going to address with the terrific speakers who have joined us today. But these are also some of the many issues that are discussed in the podcast we're launching today, Mosul and the Islamic State. The 4-part series is co-hosted by Omar Mohammed, who reported on ISIS atrocities under the pen name Mosul I after the city was captured in 2014, and Program on Extremism Senior Fellow Haroro Ingram. I've had the opportunity to listen to the podcast, and it's phenomenal. Omar and Haroro did a terrific job at explaining the issue from both a macro and a micro level, through the words of prestigious guests like CIA Director General Petraeus and former Iraqi Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi, and through those of the dozens of ordinary residents of Mosul who for the first time told their story. A podcast is a bit of a new endeavor for us at the program, and we're very proud of it. I know how much work the team behind it, which includes the great contribution of Andrew Mines, has put into it. And I hope you can all listen to it as we release the episodes over the next few weeks. But without further ado, I would like to start our conversation. The way we're structuring the event today is that we're first going to have 2 taped statements from 2 friends of the program who could not join us today live, but sent a recording. And then we're going to move to a more live conversation. So we're going to start off with comments from Kareem Khan. Mr. Khan was recently appointed chief prosecutor at the International Criminal Court, but was previously the head of UNITAD, the United Nations investigative team to promote accountability for crimes committed by Daesh. We've had the opportunity to cooperate with Mr. Khan and his team at UNITAD, and they do terrific work in trying to bring justice for the victims of the Islamic State. So I look forward to his comments. So Andrew, if we can start. Volume. I'm not sure if it's audible. I think we're having a bit of a technical issue on the tape, and I hope we can fix it quickly. I apologize for that.
I am delighted to say a few words for the launch of the podcast by Omar Mohammed, known as Mosul I, that is being broadcast in conjunction with George Washington University. I had the opportunity to work with Omar Mohammed during my mandate as the first special advisor and head of UNITAD, the United Nations investigative team to promote accountability for the crimes of Daesh. The resolution of the Security Council in September 2017 and the deployment of my team in October 2018 to Iraq marked an important moment. It marked the unanimous determination by the United Nations Security Council that justice and accountability was a key component if the horrors of Daesh were to be exposed, and if the rights of survivors and victims to justice was to be achieved. Words are not enough. Action is needed. Courage is needed. And the courage that I applaud first and foremost are the survivors. And who are the survivors? The survivors are everybody that came into contact with Daesh, who were threatened by Daesh, whose life, whose beliefs, whose freedom was constrained by this most un-Islamic state. The focus on Mosul is apt. Mosul is one of the ancient cities of the world. It has, for millennia, been a cradle of civilization. And even up to the there in the marketplace, that was there in the mosques and in the churches and in the temples, was one reason why Iraq managed to have such a glorious history. Attempts to suffocate it, attempts to homogenize it, is to kill that essence of diversity that is one of the keys for communities, for nations to rise up and lead the world. Omar himself has demonstrated extraordinary bravery, immense courage. Because as people were being thrown off buildings in Mosul, as Daesh deliberately tried to broadcast the crucifixions, the killings, the burnings, the drownings, the weaponization of the most innocent of us, our children, he was willing, at great life to himself, a great risk to his own life and the life of his mother, his family. He tried and he succeeded in letting the world know what was happening in the darkness, in the suffocation that was Mosul. Suffocation that had become Mosul. And in a city of light, the darkness that had descended upon it and that enveloped so much failed to extinguish the light of Omar and so many other individuals in Mosul. Almost 7 years ago today, Mosul fell in June 2014, just over 7 years ago. 4 years ago, Mosul was liberated in the sense that Daesh no longer controlled that city and the government of Iraq forces could move in. And when I have been to Mosul over the last few years, I have seen on every trip a vibrancy start to return. Not only that is evident with His Holiness the Pope's visit in March of this year, but also with the rebuilding of the mosques and the return of individuals. But justice cannot be forgotten, because the ideology of Daesh is what makes it so dangerous. Surah Al-Baqarah of the Holy Quran proclaims in chapter 2, La ikraha fi din, that there is no compulsion in the matter of religion. Truth of this matter is what I said earlier, that for more than 1,000 years, Jew and Christian and Muslim, Shia and Sunni, without distinction, Yazidis, could worship, could thrive in Iraq and in Mosul. This tyranny of Daesh, which seeks conformity, the tyranny of conformity that would take free people and subject them to slavery, needs to be exposed, not by polemics, not only by priests and religious leaders in their mosques, in their temples, in their synagogues, proclaiming that this is the antithesis of Islam, but by exposing it in the crucible of the courtroom. This was the mandate that UNITAD was given by the Security Council. Great work has been done. The announcement to the Security Council in the last report I presented before assuming my current responsibilities made it clear that acts constituting genocide had been committed by Daesh. But the full panoply of crimes requires more urgent investigations. We look forward to the government of Iraq implementing domestic legislation that will allow it to prosecute the crimes of Daesh not as generic terrorism, but to call crimes what they were. Crimes that intended to destroy in whole or in part peoples. Crimes against humanity and war crimes. By doing that, we will hopefully manage to achieve what was underlined by the Security Council, the imperative to confront violent extremism. This is the age when moderation needs to be preserved. This is the age when diversity needs to be protected. And this is the age in which complacency must be eschewed. And instead of complacency, as Virgil said, the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. This podcast is the sentry on duty, along with other actors, other individuals that make up the mosaic of Iraq, to call out what took place, not as some important discipline of history by itself, but the real raison d'etre of history, to learn from the past so we're not condemned to commit or to fall victim of the same crimes in the future. I wish this podcast every success, and I applaud Omar Mohammed, George Washington University, and all who join hands in this common endeavor to repudiate this most un-Islamic state and instead to embrace humanity and actually the name of Islam, which means peace. I end with that. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. May the peace and blessings of God be upon you all. Thank you so much.
Excellent. First of all, I want to apologize a bit for some of the technical issues we've had. I'm sure we all understand, it is hosting an event during, on Zoom in pandemic days. These are very important words from Mr. Khan. I think he emphasized some of the most important topics that we address also in the podcast: the need for justice, the work that UNITAD under Mr. Khan's leadership and also in the coming months will be doing is something extremely important in a very difficult environment. So it was really a pleasure working with him and working with UNITAD. We now move to our second pre-recorded contribution, which comes from an equally important speaker, and we're really flattered that he also decided to join us for a statement, and that's General David Petraeus, who obviously needs no introduction. And as everybody knows, he was the main architect of the surge in Iraq in 2007, and then later served as director of the CIA. So without further ado, Andrew, if we can start General Petraeus' speech.
Shukran jazilan, Siddiqui, to you for your extraordinary courage, your fortitude, your determination, your creativity in keeping the outside world informed through the Mosul Eye blog that you wrote, and also to recognize, to ensure that you know that was muhim jiddan. It was hugely important. It was, again, the best set of insights into what was going on in a city that is near and dear to me and many of the other Americans who were privileged to serve there. And again, I think it's easy to overlook how dangerous this was for you. This could have been fatal frankly, and yet you stuck to it, you continued it, and you provided just a terrific source of on-the-ground information that really could not be gained through any other means. So again, I want to say mabruk to you, and again, shukran jazilan to you for what you did during that time, and frankly also for what you have done since then in a variety of different ways to get trees planted in Mosul, to get the reconstruction going, to bring back the Mosul Museum and try to repair the terrible damage done by the Islamic State to some of the other architectural locations of great importance to really to humanity and to history. And so again, you have done really impressive work, and you're still a young man with enormous opportunities ahead. I do have hope for Mosul. It is obviously, in a sense, conditional. It obviously, there are some cautions associated with it. You know, the old phrase, I am cautiously optimistic. And I am. If, as long as the Moslawis, as long as the people of Mosul aren't interfered with by outside extremist groups or divisive political elements, by, again, ethnic sectarian elements that are trying to pull the city apart, I'm confident that that city will come back together. I saw that with my own eyes. I had dinner with groups of Arabs and Kurds, Shia and Sunni, Turkmen, Christian, Yazidi, Shabak, others that I'm sure I'm forgetting. And again, that city is unique. It's the city through which multiple fault lines of history have run. And it is one that has worked in the past, and I hope will work once again in the future, as really, you know, testimony to what humans can do if they are tolerant of one another, and if they are willing to reach across ethnic and sectarian and tribal and political divides. You have to have a nuanced understanding of a situation. You can only get that by spending time with the people. If you can't do that physically, then obviously the next best thing is to do it virtually. You know, when I arrived in Mosul, as you know, I spent an intensive 2-week period doing nothing but from dawn till well after dusk, meeting with the people, the citizens of Nainawa province, and trying to understand them as quickly as I possibly could to get an appreciation for all of the different elements of society, and thereby then to put together a body that would be representative of all the people in rough proportion to their size, if you will, in the Nainawa province, and would also be as responsive as was possible given the means available to all of those different elements, and to ensure that while there would be majority rules, there would also be minority rights. And those were the guiding big ideas for the formation of the interim provincial council of Nainawa, and the selection of the interim governor and deputy governors. And it was wonderful to have Moslawis help me as the commander of that area of Iraq, and therefore under the Geneva Convention, responsible for the executive, legislative, and judicial all in one as an occupying force commander by international law. But to do all of this together with Moslawis, and to ensure that we learned as rapidly as we could about all of the different elements in society, how the province was supposed to work, how it really worked, where the district lines were. We couldn't even get agreement on that at various times, as you may know. So again, it was imperative that we do that. And yet we were the only ones in all of Iraq that carried out such an intensive effort and had a provincial council, interim provincial council, as early as was possible. And by the way, later on, when it was finally also possible to do that, we added some women to the provincial council. That was not something I could get done in the beginning, but we did over time so that truly all citizens of Nainoa province were represented. But it was a really unique period where everyone was working together, and Nainoa province was functioning and doing well until tragically the seeds of extremism and insurgency were able to get root there as well, and to begin that process that we've seen back and forth a couple of different times now since 2003.
Excellent. I think we're done with General Petraeus, and I want to thank him as well, of course, for the comments, the remarks he made. I think what I particularly appreciate was the tone of moderate optimism that he expressed for this city of Mosul, and that's something clearly important. Many things are needed in Mosul, but I think education is one of the most important things in rebuilding the city and its infrastructure, its fibers, its vitality. So I cannot think of a better speaker to have next than Zineb Ghanim, who is the Dean of the School of Law at Nineveh University in Mosul. I know we had some issues with the connection with Professor Ghanim, so I hope everything is sorted out. If so is, Professor Ghanim, the floor is yours.
السلام عليكم. السلام عليكم.
عليكم السلام. I think I will have to translate, Lorenzo.
That's fine.
أهلا دكتورة، راح أترجم من العربية للإنجليزية.
حياكم الله جميعا.
Welcome everyone.
في البداية أحب أن أشكر كل القائمين على هذا النشاط العلمي الذي سمح لي المشاركة، وأنا أتشرف في المشاركة معكم. أنا سأحدثكم. نعم تفضل.
I would like to thank the organizers of this event and for inviting me. It's a privilege to be here with you.
أنا أحب أن أحدثكم اليوم عن معاناة النساء اليزيديات وقت فترة داعش الإرهابي.
I would like to explain and discuss with you today the suffering of the Yazidi women as a result of the ISIS genocide against the Yazidis.
رغم القانون الجديد فإن الخطر لا زال يلاحق الناجيات اليزيديات، فيمثل قانون الناجيات اليزيديات باقة أمل لإنصاف هذه الفئة التي تعرضت للسبي والاختطاف والاستبعاد من لدن عناصر داعش في العراق وتحديدا في الموصل مدينة سنجار.
Part of this is the recently issued law by the Iraqi government, which is designated specifically for the women survivors, the Yazidi women survivors, a law that provide protection to them, although it's not enough for them, but it might be a good step forward to protect the Yazidi women and to do justice to them.
غير أنه من المتأمل لأحوال البلد والبنود القانون قد يتعرف على عدة نواقص، فقد مرر البرلمان العراقي مؤخرا قانون الناجيات اليزيديات.
And this law was passed by the Iraqi parliament, although it still has some flaws, but this as she said, this law can be a good start toward establishment of a much better law to protect the Yazidi women, especially the survivors.
الذي يعترف بالجرائم الخطيرة التي ارتكبها مقاتلو تنظيم داعش الإرهابي بحق النساء المنتميات إلى هذه الأقلية الأيزيدية.
Which is designed specifically for the crimes Daesh committed against the Yazidi women in Iraq.
ويصنفها تحت مسمى الجرائم ضد الإنسانية.
And it is designated as crimes against humanity.
وقد قام هذا التنظيم الإرهابي تحديدا في منطقة سنجار شمال العراق في آب 2014 ومقاتلوه على مدار 3 سنوات بأعمال جدا مروعة من قتل واغتصاب واختطاف وسبي وحتى بيع في الأسواق.
Over 3 years since August 2014, ISIS committed unimaginable crimes in Sinjar, enslaving women, killing men, and committing horrible crimes against humanity.
يعد هذا القانون هو الأول من نوعه في كل الدول الناطقة بالعربية الذي ينص على اهتمام يخص النساء الناجيات من هذه الجرائم.
Therefore, this law, which is the law for the protection of Yazidi women, the survivors, is the first law to be established and issued in an Arab country, which is Iraq, that provide the protection to the Yazidi women specifically for this case.
وهناك إحصائية تقول أن بما يقارب 10,000 يزيدي وأيزيدية قد قتلوا وتعرضوا للاختطاف خلال هذه الفترة.
The recent statistics have concluded that more than 10,000 Yazidi women, children, and men have been killed or executed by Daesh.
وأنا بوصفي عميد كلية القانون في جامعة نينوى خلال هذه الفترة قمنا بالاطلاع على أحوال الطالبات الأيزيديات اللي هي من إحدى طالباتنا فتبين أن لدينا العديد من الطالبات المقيمات في المخيم.
As the Dean of School of Law at Nineveh University, we have recently discovered that many of our students are actually Yazidi women, the survivors, and they live in the camps. However, they go to the university.
يعني تخيلوا أنه لحد الآن لدينا طالبة تقيم هي أيزيدية تقيم في المخيم وقد قمنا بزيارة لها ولكن هي كانت جدا متفائلة ومتكيفة مع الوضعية وحتى تقديراتها في المواد العلمية جيد جدا.
Despite being displaced and living in a camp, a survivor Yazidi woman is a bright student of law at the School of Law in Nineveh University. She is still continuing her studies and she is being visited regularly by the Dean of School of Law herself.
ما ندعو إليه نتمنى أن نخرج من هذا المحفل العلمي بمخرجات لصالح هؤلاء الفئات وذلك بتأهيلهم.
We hope that such kind of meetings and events can result in important discussions toward establishing the tools for justice and giving back, making justice to the survivors, especially the Yazidi women.
وإعادة دمجهم في المجتمع.
And working on the reintegration of the Yazidi women and survivors in the community.
إذ غير من المعقول أن يبقى الحال على ما هو عليه الآن لأنهم تعرضوا للكثير من الجرائم والمعاناة ولحد الآن هم موجودين في المخيمات علما أن المخيمات هي غير مؤهلة بالشكل المطلوب لتوفير الخدمات الكاملة لهم.
It's unbelievable to know such an unimaginable situation the Yazidi survivors are living in. They are still living in camps for displaced people. Those camps do not meet even the basic needs of humans. They don't have access to the basic needs.
كان بودي أن أتحدث أكثر في هذا المجال ولكن الوقت لا يسعنا. يكفيني شرف المشاركة. كل الشكر والتقدير للجميع. كل الشكر والتقدير لك دكتور عمر محمد. تحياتي لكم وللقائمين على هذا النشاط العلمي، والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
I wish I could speak more, but I stop here. I would like to thank again the organizers, and she also say thanks to Omar. It's me, and she wished to continue more discussions with the program on extremism. Thank you. شكرا جزيلا دكتورة زينة.
شكرا لك. شكرا. بارك الله فيك.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate it. And I think there's also some optimistic and hopeful notes in terms of, for example, Yazidi students, female students in particular, going to University of Nineveh. I think that's some positive notes. What I want to do now, after these first three speeches, is move into more of a conversation, and that will be between clearly the guest of honor of the day, and calling a guest is probably reductive, which is Omar, our own fellow, senior fellow, Haroro Ingram, and our last guest, which I haven't introduced yet, and I apologize for that, although he needs some introduction as well, and that's Graham Wood from Yale University and the Atlantic. So I think it would be, for the time we have left, which is quite a bit, what I would like to do is have a conversation between the three of them in which Omar and Aurora in particular discuss a bit the podcast, of course, without giving away too much of the very intense content of it, what the challenges were, what they're trying to achieve with it, and then having a conversation with Graham about it. Let me just say as a final comment that we're extremely delighted as Program on Extremism to have been able to work with Omar on the podcast and on other projects. It's been really a pleasure from all points of view, from a professional and a personal point of view. It's been a real delight to interact with Omar, and I really hope this is just the beginning of a cooperation between us and him. So Omar, it's your day, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Lorenzo. In fact, I don't know what to say. We have been discussing this podcast for over 10 or 11 months. If you remember, Lorenzo, when I asked you, we need to do a podcast, and you said yes, go ahead. And then the conversation started with Harora. I wish Harora can put on his camera. I want the people to see him. We started the conversation, and I didn't expect that this conversation is gonna be something. It was unique to me because the amount of information that we discussed, the amount of the historical context that we went through, we digged deep inside the history of Mosul, the history of Iraq. We went very deep inside very small events, and he told me what happened in Mosul. The people know that Mosul fell on June 2014. That's all what they know, but they don't know what are the events that predated that fall and the events after that. So it was my answer, and I always say this, it's all about the small details. History to me is the small details. It's the small details that shape the image of history, and people often do not look into those small details. They are tiring, exhausting. It makes you sleepless. You don't sleep. You don't eat. You get nervous. Those small details, what we were discussing. I have been in discussion with him and Andrew as well. As probably you know, we are in 3 separate continents. Like there is 11 hours between me and Aurora, 6 hours between me and Andrew, yet we were going through these details. The core idea is how can we tell the story of a very disturbing event, disturbing to everyone, confusing events. How can we translate such kind of extremism, brutality into something readable? It was troubling to me, to Haroro. the kind of questions that he was asking, they were making me sleepless. They were triggering all of the fears I had, but we went through all of this. And I realized at the end of all of this, and I've been always consulting Lorenzo, asking him how this is going. Then I go back to Haroro, but then I realized something, because I have studied Orientalism, and I have always heard this kind of story that if you are a Westerner, you shouldn't study the East, otherwise you will be called Orientalist, etc. This kind of argument, it doesn't stand anymore, because Haroro, myself, Lorenzo, Shaimas as well, Devora and Andrew, it's not about being from the West or being from the East. It's about, do you have the ability to look into the context? Are you ready to look into the context of the events? Are you ready to look into the human side of the events? Are you ready to look into this not as a story, but as something that affects humans on a daily basis, and it will affect them for the rest of their life? Because such kind of events, they create traumas, and in one story you cannot translate the trauma that people are living. That's how we came into this kind of a group, a team, discussing every single details, every troubling details. And I have I don't want to spoil the podcast, but you will listen to the podcast and you will probably notice even sometimes my voice changed, because the stories we were telling, they were very, 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 very troubling. But we managed to do this. And the idea is, it's also to clearly say that it's time to look into justice. It's time to raise the voice of the victims. We have heard a lot about the preparators. We have heard a lot about the criminals, but where are the victims? Why they are not speaking? Why their voice is not rising? Therefore, we try to hear all the voices. We brought people from Mosul, a musician, an artist, an entrepreneur, historians, scholars, religious leaders, priests, people from all around the city of Mosul, Nineveh, and the rest of Iraq. Many of them were in Mosul, others were in other continents, in other countries, but they felt for the same time. And I've said this to Lorenzo, to Haroro. To me, it's the first time that I feel that the voice of Mosul is heard, and that the story of Mosul for the first time is told by its own people. It's not that the other voice doesn't matter, the voice of a Western journalist or a scholar. It's not that it doesn't matter, it matters, but it's for the first time when we sought a global platform, when we sought an equal access to the global platform. And I am proudly saying this, that Program on Extremism said, yes, we are giving you this platform to the people of Mosul to tell their story. And this was the result. It's a podcast, because, and I'm going to say this part of history shouldn't be forgotten. If you are not able to read, we are going to create a podcast. If you are not going to listen, we are going to create find other ways to let you know and hear the story. If you are no more reading short text, we are going to find ways to tell you the story. We are going to make comics. We will let you, the people, read this story in any possible way of communication, whether reading, listening, by graphic designing, animation. This part of the history shouldn't be forgotten. It's a part of history that affected everyone. And it's the right of everyone to look into the context of what happened. And it's the right of the people of Mosul to put all the events on the table before they get judged. And that's what the podcast is doing, is that we are making this about justice. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Omar. I think Haroro, I want to hear your side of it. How was working on the podcast and all the dynamics?
Excellent. Well, thank you, Lorenzo, for the introductions and for chairing the opening session today. And of course, thank you to everyone that is in attendance. This is obviously a really big occasion for us at the program, and of course, particularly for Omar, Andrew, and myself, as we've been working on this podcast for some time now, and it's great to get the first episode out. Now, I'm going to keep my remarks brief so that we can kind of begin the discussion and, of course, involve the audience. So please don't wait. Use the chat function in Zoom to send through your questions, and I'll be incorporating those into our conversation after we hear Graham. Now, the Mosul and the Islamic State podcast has, as I said before, it's involved a lot of work by a relatively small team, just the three of us, and we've been in production, recording, editing, re-recording, finalizing interviews for a few months. And it has literally been an around-the-clock effort. As Omar had said, I'm currently living in a little town on the east coast of Australia. That's 8 hours ahead of Omar, who's in Paris, and 14 hours ahead of Andrew, who's in Washington, DC. And then when you add in all the different interviews that we've had over the last few months, it has been quite an enormous, task. But this podcast really is the product of even more than that. Before the idea of a podcast was even brought up, Omar and I were talking most days of the week, well, probably every day of the week during COVID lockdown since about March or April of last year. And those conversations almost always drifted back to 3 points. Our frustrations at how local people, the people that we'd worked with, the victims, the survivors, I would say the true front line of resistance against groups like Daesh, and they were almost always on the sidelines, that they were too often, for example, a means to an end for academics and journalists kind of to make their careers. There's frustrations that we had at the frequent kind of cynicism that would come from, I guess, what you could call the kind of the policy ivory towers that are far from the ground, yet talk so confidently about the way it is and the way it's going to be. And of course, how not just the lessons of history, but the words and actions of our adversaries readily available in primary source materials are too often ignored. And so a major hope that Omar, Andrew, and I have for this podcast is that we sufficiently and appropriately elevate Maslawi voices and experiences to the forefront, and hopefully present a very human, warts and all, successes and failures, hopes and crises, perspective of both this historical period, but also what is happening right now, the pursuit of justice, the rebuilding of a city, and the rehabilitation of its people. And we want to highlight the very real reasons to be optimistic. This is something which Lorenzo has emphasized in his remarks. There are very real reasons to be optimistic about Mosul's future. And we hope that that does shine through the podcast. And another aspect that has been important for us, and Omar's spoken a lot about this in his remarks, is the little details. The small events and interactions and experiences which only a local will know. And we've tried to draw out those little details to help build what is really a complex story of kind of interweaving narratives. And the challenge for us was really how to bring together what I describe as 4 layers of stories. You have first the Maslawi experiences, so the view from the streets of Mosul. Second, and having recently released the ISIS Reader, this was forefront of my mind certainly, was that the podcast needs to take you inside the Islamic State organization, to witness the inner workings of the group as it strategizes over the years. Third, we need to incorporate the perspectives from those who were there, from US generals to combat veterans, Iraqi prime ministers to journalists, and basically everyone in between. And finally, and to be honest, most awkwardly for Omar, was to tell his story. Now, I say awkwardly for Omar because he wanted to tell other people's stories, and we were just flooded with interviews that Omar was conducting with people. And of course we do tell those stories. But Omar's life, his experiences, were such an important way to tell those broader stories. Now, we have some extraordinary interviews with Maslawis, including, for instance, Rasha Al-Akidi, very proud Maslawi and a phenomenal analyst, as well as dozens of everyday Maslawis as well. And this was very important to us. Now, this commitment to ensuring that Maslawis were central to the podcast extended beyond the interviews. The music that you hear in the introduction of every episode of Mosul and the Islamic State was written and performed by the Maslawi musician, he's a violinist and a cellist, Amin Moqdad. The beautiful artwork that we use for the podcast is by a Maslawi artist, Farah Al-Yusuf, and it is drawn from we take it from a panorama painting that she did that represents the history of Mosul, but also its future. And so the image that we have selected for each podcast episode draws from Farah's painting to symbolically kind of represent this progress through history, which her painting tries to express. And I think does really well. There's another level of detail here. I mean, the sounds that you hear are the original sounds. The episode 1 teaser that was released this morning is a great example, I think. You know, as you are hearing that list of attacks, you are hearing the actual explosion, the street noises from those attacks. The more general sounds that you hear throughout the podcast, whether it's of different attacks or street noises, of speeches, of propaganda releases, whatever it may be, those are taken from whatever period we are referring to. So, and finally, when we talk about the details, key sources that were used to inform the research underpinning each episode, we will make them available on the Program on Extremism website. So all of the details, all of that research can be followed up through those links. I'm going to wrap up now with just a few quick words of thanks. Firstly, to Lorenzo and Seamus for the opportunity to work on this project. You know, in about November of last year, when we were all confirmed to work on this podcast, and you know, working for these guys is great because the conversation at the beginning was basically, hey, are you guys right? Do you need anything else from us? And, you know, kind of said, no, I think we're fine. And they said, okay, well, we'll see you when it's done, you know, and that's fantastic, you know, because that's that confidence that you need when you're going into a new endeavor that you're not, frankly, we're not entirely sure about. That was really great. And I especially appreciated it as well because, you know, Seamus and Lorenzo had been talking to me for a while about different styles of writing and publishing in different forums, you know, kind of telling stories. And so this was a great opportunity that I've really appreciated. And of course, very, very fortunate to be working with such a fantastic team. So of course, thanks to Omar, none of this would be possible without him, without his efforts, without the interviews that he's done and the story that he's been willing to tell, which is very, very visceral and raw. There's a lot of detail that comes out in this, which you know, as a friend, I was saying, you know, are you fine to talk about this? And the answer was yes. And so I really hope that people appreciate that name and that symbol, Mosul, that resistance to not just the Islamic State, but to authoritarianism and pursuing freedom and justice, that there is a human being behind Mosul. And I hope that through this podcast that side comes out as well. And lastly, you know, none of this is possible without Andrew working on audio. So a huge thanks to you. You know, I realize that it can't be easy dealing with Omar and I every day, morning and night, and you've been fantastic throughout this process. You know, we've kind of come in. I mean, I had kind of ideas about the way that I would hope how the story would progress, and you know, the way that it would fit together. And throughout this process, Andrew has always responded with not only with yes and delivered, but come back many times with, hey, here are some other options which I think achieve what you guys are looking for, but in a better way. And he's been consistently right. So we really do appreciate that from Andrew. So I'm going to leave it there with that thanks, and just pass it over to Graham to say a few words before we go into the discussion. So thank you, and over to you, Graham. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Horo. Lorenzo, am I giving my final remarks now, or is this part of the entry into the discussion?
I think I would love to have I think we do have time for like maybe some 20 minutes of conversation. I mean, some remarks from you, and ideally goes into a conversation. I mean, Haroro talked about storytelling, and if I think who's the best storyteller in the business when it comes to ISIS, and not only, that's you. So how this whole thing, oh, no, come on, Grant.
All right.
So
well,
obviously that's on you now.
So I have many curiosities, not just about Mosul, but about how the three of you have put together this story, which there's so many difficulties in telling a story of this size. And one of the virtues that I've heard in the first episode of this podcast is that you do not at all tend, it seems, to fall into one of the usual sort of monocausal explanations for what has happened. You do not shy at all away from instead saying, we need to look back deeper into history. We need to talk about this, that. We need to talk about time going back decades rather than just a couple of years, which I think has been the temptation for a lot of foreign journalists, and in general is a pitfall that any serious storyteller should try to avoid, which you seem to have done. That said, there's a reason monocausal explanations are so popular. It's because it's very difficult to convey something as complex as a historical process that ends as this has. So now that I've heard the beginning of your podcast, where you give some of the historical background and some of the beginnings of the story of how the Islamic State came to be and what it was, I want you to give me a bit of a preview of how this is going to come together. Is there a cause that you think is going to emerge among the many that are important as the one that you think everybody should understand and that they do not understand well enough so far? Is there a narrowing down of this background into a point that you think is underappreciated and that you think our audience today might want you to stress? So Omar and Horo, I think either of you could speak to this question, but broadly, going from the virtue of broadness to the specifics that are usually necessary to tell a story, where does it finally narrow down to, and what would you like people to know if they have to be rather specific and can't stay in the broad historical background forever?
I think, Aurora, I think you agree with me that Graham's remarks made me happy as well as you, because this is exactly the response that we were expecting when anyone listened to the episode 1. They will say, where is this going to take me? What is the second line of the story? What is the third line of the story? What is the fourth line of the story? What is the end of the story, and how it ends. That's how it's structured, is that you will always see us going back into the history and then jumping in from the last 2 decades into something current, trying to make sense of events that seems very difficult to make sense. An event happened in the middle of 2005 is impossible to be understood if you don't go back and forth between 2003 and 2014. There is something very important, and I don't know if I am allowed, Haroro, to spoil some of the key points, but there is something very important in this story, is that what they call the lost opportunities, or the chances that the people had. You know, Graham, that history has no this kind of use of like, if this happened, this would be. But when it comes to the future, if you work the history this way, because we are creating the history. So if we create the formula of the history, at least we can expect the results of the future. This is exactly what we want to tell, is that after 2003, something unique happened, but it was missed, not only by the people, it was missed by those who had the opportunity to invest in this, to invest in this civil world, in this civil society, people who were there, people who were waiting for the change. And I think General Petraeus elaborated more about this. I wish we can release his full interview in the podcast. There were things that were happening, they don't make sense if you look at only one part of them. You have to put them all together as one piece in order to understand what really happened. And then at the end, it comes the question, like, are you ready to acknowledge the mistakes you have done and to take the responsibility for everything went wrong in order to move forward to find the solution and to try to bring back the same lost opportunities, because they might seem lost opportunities, they are not. There is still a possibility to bring them back. And I think Haroro will explain this much better than me. I leave it to you, Haroro.
No, not at all. Look, Graham, it's a fantastic question, and I think that the whole idea of starting with that breadth was to provide that context, not just the historical kind of context, but it was also a way, of course, to start to introduce the key character here and to connect. And I think that's a really important part, because if our minds only go back so far, there are these characterizations that we have of that history and the people that have emerged from that history. As you said, this tendency to go back all the way to 2003. Well, that wasn't sufficient. Let's understand what this generation has experienced. And it's upon that foundation, the foundation established in episode 1, that the theme for me, and I think that people can listen to this, and I hope that they generate their own interpretations and thoughts about it. And perhaps I am giving it away a little bit, but the theme for me is that you have this generation of people who have experienced nothing but war and sanctions and hardships. And then they get to 2003, and broadly the response to US coalition operations is, what an opportunity. You know, this is an opportunity to break free of dictatorship, to break free of authoritarianism. And despite that background, despite those experiences, the push in a place like Mosul, as an example, which now so sadly has become, symbolic of violent extremism, was actually to try to get a democracy started, to try and get popular government started. That, for me, for us, is really the central story here, is the opportunities that were lost at a grassroots local level. And as someone who, through 2014, through the 2016-17, had spent time with the Free Syria media, I spent a lot of the chunk of my time in Syria. And since then, I've spent a lot of my time in Mindanao in the southern Philippines. I'm working there. it's a recurring theme for me that there are these local grassroots efforts, and they are so often, I suspect, I don't think people do it on purpose, but they are arrogantly missed. That there is this centralized approach that inevitably is prioritized, that we must work from the capital cities out. And so what happens is that these pockets of opportunity end up becoming lost. Partnered with that is the missed lessons of history, but also the lessons that emerge from taking notice of our adversaries, of actually listening to our adversaries. And the way in which, for example, the Islamic State has consistently demonstrated, when you look at their doctrine, when you look at the materials, when you look at captured materials, that they very, very carefully and strategically consider opportunities. And rather than look at exploiting actors, they look to exploit context. How can I manipulate and change this environment so that it is more conducive to my strategic objectives as opposed to those of others? And they have of my adversaries. And so they then implement what is actually a very localized approach, a street by house by house, street by street, block by block, community by community. And what happens? As local grassroots opportunities are missed, and this adversary that is so good at exploiting opportunities and creating opportunities by, to use a line that Omar uses, create the chaos, settle the chaos, that it creates these compounding cycles, mutually reinforcing cycles that are so devastating. I'm actually interested in your views, Graham. I mean, like, what with your reflections on I guess the last, well, I mean, we could go back to 2014, but now that we've started going back even further than that, I mean, how do you see the key? What, in your sense, is the key driver of this threat?
So my tendency is actually to dodge your question, because the period even immediately before the fall of Mosul feels like a blind spot for journalism, for my profession. I was last in Mosul at the very beginning of 2013, which means more than a year before the fall of Mosul to the Islamic State. And to my surprise, I haven't found, I can't think of any journalists who were there in the time between them. So the year between the time when I was there and when ISIS rolled into town. So it feels like it's nearly impossible for someone in my profession, which prizes being there, talking to people, seeing with our own eyes what's going on, to explain what happens in what is essentially a mysterious year. That's one of the things that I most look forward to hearing about in this podcast, is what was the transformation that took place during that time, when I should say at the beginning of 2013, it was obvious that things were not headed in a good direction. But to find the decisive moments, key moments along the way, when even the whole year is hidden from people in where I'm sitting, it would feel false to try to isolate one of those when in a condition of such blindness. What I hear in your remarks, Hara, that really interests me is the ability of ISIS to, as you say, be opportunistic and to be clever in its understanding of its adversaries, to pick up abilities to change, strengthen itself, to use the lessons of others. I wanted to put to Omar a different question, because he speaks in the first episode about kind of real opposition in Mosul, people who didn't leave the city, who were anti-authoritarian, who were quietly working. I want to know, were these people not as clever at learning from their adversaries? What was it about the way that this opposition that Omar, you're on the side of and a representative of, why were they not as able as the Islamic State or Islamist oppositions in general to to grow, to create opportunities for themselves, and to learn from the failures of their adversaries. What happened?
Yes, you know that part of the research for the episode is speaking to people who were assigned to develop these civil administrations in Mosul after 2003. And one of those people, I refrain from mentioning his name, he was assigned, he's European, he was assigned to build the civil administration in Mosul. He met with all those people who were in the civil opposition, who were in Iraq, in Mosul, under Saddam, opposing Saddam, advocating for democracy, waiting for the moment to happen, to come, and then they would start. What really went wrong, he was looking into really great opportunities. They were communicating with him. People had experience in even constitution, civil administration, etc. What went wrong is the de-Baathification destroyed all the opportunities that those people who believed in democracy, because they understand that building the democracy takes time and it takes peaceful means. But what happened is that those who wanted to establish themselves, they don't believe in the peaceful means. They believe that, well, I have my weapon, I can fight back and I can take back my rights. Therefore, they found themselves in the middle between the US troops that was trying, and I trust General Petraeus when he mentioned to me several times, and he mentioned even confidential stories about how he tried to even find jobs for those who were listed in the de-Baathification, because he knew that they should remain in their positions. But what happened is the rise of jihadism. Those people who were angry at the Americans and at the newly established government, the Americans couldn't afford investing in the civil administrations. It's too costly for them. That's what this person who was assigned to build this administration, he told me. He said that it was too costly for them and they cannot focus on fighting back the jihadists and building the civil administrations. Therefore, when they saw this, and also when the Islamists rose, those people cannot, as I said again, they cannot fight with weapons. They don't know how to do this. Therefore, they felt that they were betrayed by the Americans. And they know that they have no support. No one can protect them. And they will be just literally killed, which has happened. I mean, some of them were killed. They withdraw because they knew that if they continue, there is no way to survive. The others have overpowered them. They have the weapons, and starting from 2004, exactly 2004, the only language in Iraq it's the language of arms, it's the language of weapons, it's the language of violence. And those people who felt that, especially the civil administration of the United States in Iraq, they thought that they would focus on, or at least I would say this frankly, that they would tell the opposition that came from outside Iraq, thank you for your service, well done, it's enough here, you can rest. We are going to deal with the opposition that is already there, the people who knows how to deal with the country. But this didn't happen. And then came the sectarianism, and then came more tribalism. The tribalism, I also assigned it to the failure of the US administration in Iraq, because they needed men to fight. And you probably already know, this was also one of the results that the Sahwa happened when Bush visited Anbar. They focused more on Anbar because it's more tribal than to build civil administrations. And I quote here from from General Petraeus again. He said that he was conveying to the Americans, to the US administration, that it's the surge of ideas what matters, not the surge of weapons and force. But believe me, they weren't listening. And I think my professor is one of the people who are listening to us today, Dr. Arthur Goldschmidt. Yes, I think he is here. He told me about also a very important person, and I admired him for his intelligence. He was serving in Iraq. I read his testimony, and I read many of his private writings about. He was keeping in all his reports back to Washington, D.C. Stop pushing the weapons. Stop pushing the weaponizing the tribes. Invest in the civil administration. But the answer was always, we cannot focus on both. That's the thing that Daesh itself or Al Qaeda exploited, and it understood very well.
I think that if there's a kind of an additional layer to kind of add to this tension at the local grassroots level, and I think that what you're hearing from what Omar is saying is that some of the material and the interviews and what people have said as they've reflected on this is you know, it's quite telling as people have looked back with hindsight at what had happened, and people are quite frank in their interviews with us. What I would add to this as well is that there was also, it's very important to understand that at a local civil society level that there was a lot of competition at that local level as well. A lot of competition. You know, let's just take one side, the Islamist bloc.
You are spoiling it.
Right. But there was a lot of tensions there, and so it becomes really to understand this competition interaction. The one point that I think is important is that you highlighted how there is just this black hole about Islamic State from 2013. You know, from 2013, from basically Zarqawi period to about 2013, particularly the period of about 2008-9 to, as you said, 2013. Essentially, well, the majority of episode 2 is devoted to exactly that period. Why? Because it is the most important period for the Islamic State. It is one of the most revered periods for the Islamic State. This is when the two sheikhs rise. This is when Nasab al-Zarqawi is killed, the charismatic founder is killed, and the group makes an effort to stabilize by bringing in 2 leaders who would prove to be quite brilliant managers and strategists, who are willing to step back, to put their egos aside for a second, to try to stabilize this organization. And when you look at the internal thinking, the internal doctrine that emerged from this period, around that 2008-9 period, the lessons learned document, the Fallujah Memorandum, what you learn about this organization is just how seriously it took rebuilding, and why these 2 leaders are so revered. And for it to be this blind spot, and by the way, this isn't just journalists, this is a policy blind spot. This is a blind spot even, I think, within the academic literature, that this period is largely unknown, and yet the documents that emerge from that are so telling about the strategic culture within the organization, that their willingness to critically think, to identify the strengths in their adversaries, to undermine, the weaknesses to exploit, and most critically, how so much of that rebuilding strategy, they were almost decimated, really, in 2007-8. They were decimated. They came back, and that strategy hung really on one pivot point, and that was US withdrawal. And they saw that as absolutely crucial. And so much of that strategy was all about, we hold out, we implement, but we wait for that opportunity to withdraw, and we expose the Iraqi state. And that's not my words, that's ISIS doctrine. That's ISIS strategizing. And so it's an absolutely crucial period for the organization. But look, throughout this story, we try to zoom in and out of this, you know, the big moving parts, the 30,000-foot view, and something which I know is, you know, a signature of your work, which is that very personalized, the human stories as well, which I think helps people to connect with these broader dynamics. And that was an important part, I think, of how we put this, of how we put this together. I mean, as you've looked back on the history of this organization, to what extent do you think individuals were important? You know, to what extent do you think the Adnanis and the Baghdadis and the Zakawis, like, could the Islam, I mean, Graham, do you think the Islamic State movement would have evolved the way that it did without these pivotal individuals?
I think you're asking me, is that right? Yeah, I mean, even listening as I did earlier today to the first episode, and listening to the words of Zarqawi that you quote about awakening inattentive Sunnis. This is a strategic description that is so astute and so canny that it's impossible to hear these words and not think that not just the charismatic leadership, but the strategic leadership that he was showing was probably decisive in some way. That is, if there was another person who was in that position and who took the organization in a different way, then I doubt it would have been as successful. So I do think we could point to a few people along the way whose leadership, I hesitate to say irreplaceable, because we can't run hypotheticals, but they seem to be one of a kind, and they do not seem to have been replaced when they were eliminated. So yeah, the Zarqawi, Adnani, Baghdadi link, and probably a few others we could name along the way, seem to have been individually very important. And then yet again, you know, I want to bring up the context of that first episode, because although we're talking about, or I'm talking about the individual contributions that were so singular, none of these things could have happened without the broad historical context that's part of it too. And just as you say, that this decisive moment with the withdrawal of U.S. troops, you know, this was something that happened, of course, in part because of the actions of these individuals, but they were political decisions that took place, and that took place because of political considerations that were happening thousands of miles away. I mean, I remember distinctly, I mentioned my last visit to Mosul before ISIS took over, which was in the beginning of 2013. I asked people what had changed in the previous year, and someone told me the Iraqi army, they're around the airport, they don't go out. If you go out, they said to me, then don't expect anyone from the central government of Iraq to be coming to your assistance. You need to take care of yourself because of the very real danger of kidnapping. And the army is hidden away and can't be expected to keep any peace, or certainly secure you personally. So if we had in 2013, to begin 2013, a city that ceased to rely on or expect any security from the central government of Iraq, and that's going to be a broad situation that individually important, strategic, charismatic figures are going to be able to work their way into opportunistically as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's that time there. the context that you described in Mosul in 2013 during your visit, you know, that is precisely the kind of conditions which, for example, the Fallujah Memorandum says that they want to create. And that's a document that was written in 2009. And it all comes back to this, to a lot of these lines that there's this recurring line that you will hear from this group. Again, without giving too much away about the upcoming story, but we will control the night, and with time, we'll control the morning, and then we'll control the day. And there is this sense of patience to that strategy, but it's also about creating a context within which the government and the security forces are not there, that the population doesn't interact with them. And when they do interact with them, it's a negative one. Why? Because the military and the police are scared. And so they're being extra harsh, they're being extra to the population. And it just creates those gaps, which over time, the Islamic State tries to fill. There's actually a question here that we received from the audience, which Omar, perhaps you'd like to address, which is how can giving voices to victims help to prevent the violence that we saw through 2014, 15, when obviously before that? You know, how does giving a voice to victims actually help in a practical way?
Well, in fact, it's this answer, and it's very simple to say it. In fact, that ISIS or any other extremist groups, they thrived on the silence of the people. When the people are silent, Daesh or Al-Qaeda, they thrive on this silence, because behind this silence there is a grievances. Therefore, when ISIS comes, it becomes the only voice that can be heard out loud. But when you give the voice to the people, when you give them voice, when you make them speak, when you let them tell the story their own way of what they lived, I think they can take the lead of their own narrative. It's after all, it's a conflict between narratives, whose narrative is more credible and reliable. Daesh managed to create since 2005 a narrative that all Sunnis are targeted, systematically targeted by a Shia government in by a central government in Baghdad. The world is collaborating against the Sunnis in Iraq and the rest of the world. So Daesh developed this kind of narrative. But what was the alternative? We didn't hear the voice of the people. They were silent because there was fear. And Daesh was able to silence them. But when you allow them to speak, when you empower them to speak, the narrative of Daesh will no more stand, will no more be able to dominate the Sunni world. It's also about, it's much more beyond being Sunni or about Sunnism. It's about how can we raise the human voice of those people? Like, they have their own normal daily life. I mean, we know nothing about them. How can we know about it if we don't hear from them? Therefore, sharing more stories of those people, ordinary people. And I remember, Haroro, you told me something. The only way to understand what's happening either in Mosul or in Raqqa or in other cities is to spend your time not sitting only in the city or being in the city, is to go to the markets of the city, probably find a job there, and you can then know what those people want. It's the daily. Many people had nothing to do with even religion. I mean, religion to them is nothing but a tradition. It's part of the family tradition. But when you expose them to such kind of exposure to ISIS media, to all of this kind of well-designed propaganda, they will fall to it. But it's vital that you give them the voice to speak. Therefore, and this is what I have been always thinking about, is part of the problem is the academics, scholars, writers, historians, etc. They didn't speak. They didn't discuss very difficult issues in the war. For example, holding accountable those who made the mistake in Iraq. But what happened is we let Daesh to speak, not us. We should have discussed all of these things long before. We should have discussed this locally, regionally, internationally. It's us, the people, the citizens, before we become historians, scholars, etc. We are citizens. Therefore, it's vital that we tell the narrative, not let Daesh fill the gap and take the lead of the narrative. That's why I think it's vital and it's essential to prevent Daesh or any terrorist group from taking the lead again.
If I may say something as well, Omar has just given what I would characterize as a moral explanation by the voices of victims, and also just the voices of Mosulis should be centered, as we now say. I would also suggest a kind of amoral reason for this. As a journalist, I am in a kind of amoral profession, or we like to think of ourselves this way, as describing what's in the world. And this is simply the fact that people will not trust your reporting if you do not have those voices. If you omit the voices of Mosulis, if you omit the voices of victims, perhaps you're doing something that's immoral. You're certainly doing something that makes the story that you're telling harder to believe, because it's obvious that there is a huge portion of the affected people of a situation who are simply absent from the narrative. So whatever virtues there are inherently of having this, there are practical virtues of being able to tell a story as a journalist or podcaster that feels like it's a story that actually describes what's happening on planet Earth, rather than a badly skewed one that is focused on just a small subset of the affected humans in the story you're trying to tell.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we're seeing this in academia as well with field research. And there was already a reluctance, there was already a hesitancy to send researchers into the field, into places like Iraq and Syria and in Mindanao and into Nigeria and in these different parts of the world, through parts of Latin America. There was already a risk aversion there. And now I think my great concern is that universities are going to be even less likely to approve such travel, not just because of the risk, but now there's this sense that, well, we can all do this via Zoom, you know, we can connect this way. And that is just not the case. Actually being there, doing what journalists should do and often do, which is to get on the ground and to spend time. And those of us who've spent time, you know that the only way that you actually get trust from someone is to demonstrate that trust and to spend time with them. And I think that the research field, I think that this isn't just an intellectual or methodological problem. It's a potentially a mentality and cultural problem within academia, that if we are less inclined to send people to parts of the world that are difficult, that are hard, that are potentially dangerous, whatever that may mean, then we unfortunately contribute to generations of scholars who are less inclined, who are more inclined to see the world through a computer screen, who are more inclined to believe that, well, if I kind of talk to someone who says that they're Iraqi or Filipino or Syrian through Zoom, then I'm going to get the view that I need, when we actually know that those people in the community who are perhaps most susceptible to recruitment, who have the most difficult time, they barely, you've got to spend time inside the local communities to be able to engage with them. And I think that what we're seeing, that the concerns with journalism are the same as in academia. They're the same as, you know, those who are trying to implement policy and strategy, that's something that needs to be done on the ground in a strategic way engaging with locals. There are risks, but that's why you have risk management plans. And you know, it's going to be very, very interesting to see what happens post-COVID, especially in academia. With that, there is one final question which I will pose to both of you, actually, before we go to Graham for the final word today. The question we'd received was about enablers within Mosul. And during those periods before Islamic State occupation, what were some of those enablers? What were some of those elements, whether they were ideological, they were human networks? We've already kind of talked about the contextual. What were those enablers in the past, and are those enablers present now that would make you both concerned about a potential ISIS resurgence?
Well, I mean, I think they can be summarized in 3 or 4 points. Is whether it's 2003 or until now, it's the corruption within the government, the distrust in the lack of trust in the government, that the government can provide you with your basic needs. There is no faith in the system that came after 2003. This is one, and this is always going to create problems, whether ISIS or another another problems. We still have more problems to face in Iraq. Second, and it's the education system, however. The education system is still producing problems within the community. It's not just what are the contents of the education itself, that the education enabled the hatred. It's not only this. The education is unable to produce a productive, positively productive human being in Iraq. When you finish your studies, you don't have any where to go. You either seek to find a job, and then it connects you back to the corruption in the government. The third point is, it's still, and probably people might be upset with me, especially Iraqis. We are in 2021. We still haven't been able to define what our identity is in Iraq. This crisis of identity is making more problems, communal problems between communities of Iraq. And the recent horrible events happened by Daesh, they have contributed even more to this crisis of identity, or identity crisis. If you ask an Iraqi, what is your identity? You don't get an answer, because we don't know. Are we Iraqis? Are we Christian? Are we Yazidis? Are we Muslims? Are we Shia? Are we Sunnis? What is our national identity? We don't know. Who is representing us in the government? We don't know. I go and put my vote in the box. I don't know who is taking my vote. I don't know the person. It will be distributed in a way that I don't understand, in a system I don't understand. Those are the enablers of the terrorism. It's the combination of the corruption, political corruption, the economical corruption, and also the lack of trust. If you want to build a state, you need the people to trust you. It was the case, and it's still the same. You cannot report until now, even after all what happened, you cannot report as a human being, as a citizen, something happened against you, a crime happened against you. You cannot go and report it to the police, because you know that the justice system is not going to protect you. So those are the basic needs of the people, basic rights. If you don't feel that you are properly represented, that your rights are protected, there will be more and more crises like ISIS and other problems. And we are living currently a crisis in Iraq, a huge crisis of trust, and horrible change that's happening in southern Iraq, the fire in the hospitals, people die, people seek a hospital to heal themselves, they die burnt in the hospital. I mean, imagine what this will create. And you Haror have spoken a lot about it's layers after layers of trauma. If we are treating the trauma of 2014, we are missing the trauma of 2011. If we treat the 2011 trauma, we are missing the 2007. If you go to the 2000s, you miss the 2005, and so on. It's the legacy of trauma after trauma. It's a very complicated question that requires not only open discussion, but it requires very honest discussion, that people who are ready to go deep into the issues.
Graham, it'd be great to hear from you.
Yes. Well, the question was, I think, was directed to the two of you, but I will point out that I believe that the question was also asking about passive supporters, that is, individuals of ISIS, which was, of course, a very important category of people who may not have been early joiners, but who were quietly willing to observe and see how this experiment went, or who were at least cowardly enough to visit, even if they were in a rare position when they could. So I'll very quickly turn this question right back over to you, of whether this category of passive supporters is currently, but I will point out that there is one big difference between now and 2013, which is the Islamic State did reach a kind of high water mark where the safest thing to do was to do what would keep you alive, which is be an open supporter. And so there was no need to be a passive supporter at that point. Whereas now the view that the Islamic State will rise again to a greater glory than it achieved in 2015, 2016 is a minority view, to say the least. So the opportunity for someone to be a passive supporter today and not have revealed himself as an active one previously is pretty small. But if you wanted to take that question about passive supporters, then I think that would get to the article chat.
Yeah, I mean, I think just, I guess to wrap up from our side is just that, you know, what I think Michael's question there highlights a very important point. You know, the term that we've kind of coined for this is decisive minorities, that there are these decisive minorities in any population. And they're described as decisive minorities because they have a disproportionate effect upon what is ultimately a largely apolitical majority in any population. Most human beings want to get on with their lives. Most human beings are too focused on the mortgage and the kids and getting things got. They want to continue. You know, they want stability. But there are these decisive minorities in any population that, because of status, because of wealth, because of identity, because of tribe, whatever it might be, have a disproportionate effect. And what the Islamic State does so well, wherever it is, or at least it tries to do, is that it tries to co-opt those influential segments of the population. And those who are less inclined towards them, very simply, they will kill them. They will intimidate them. They will drive them out of town. And so the rebuilding strategy that we've spoken about, that was implemented through 2009, 10 onwards, you can rest assured that the principles of that strategy are being applied right now. And so much of what they're very likely to be focused on is not a broad brushed, general kind of populist approach, but rather, where are the fracture points and who are the decisive minorities? Who are those most influential that we can co-opt, that we can intimidate, that we can get onto our side? And what episode 2 and 3 look at is just the extent to which the Islamic State, that ISIS built those networks into the business and political elite of Mosul. And the great fear, of course, is that those enablers, those passive supporters that Michael has referred to in his question, that they will return again.
Aurora, if you just
the final,
before you go to the final question, you just mentioned something, and I would like our audience to know that in order to understand episode 1, you have to listen to episode 4, and in order to understand episode 4, you have to listen to episode 2, and for the episode 2, you have to go back to episode 4 and then to the episode 3. You will be in a way that once you finish the podcast, you say, no, I want to go back. I want to go back to episode 1. And then once you go back to episode 1, I say, like, let me go back to episode 4. This is what we were trying to make you look, is it's not easy to understand the events. Therefore, we are making you feeling a little bit uncomfortable listening to this, but it's going to give you answers that you have been asking for a very long time.
Thank you. Graham, over to you.
All right. Well, thank you all. And thanks to, that was very interesting, Omar. I think I see a copy of the works of Borges on your shelf, and maybe you've been reading too many if we have to listen to 4 to get to 1 and back and forth. But I think that's fantastic. And I look forward to many experiments in narrative as the episodes go on. I just want to say very quickly, the punchline to what I remarked is just that you should all listen to this podcast. It's fascinating, and it fills a really deep trench of missing information that we all should have. So thanks to the Program on Extremism, to Lorenzo, Zina, thank you so much for being here as well. And again, congratulations to Andrew, to Aurora, and of course to Omar. You know, when I have looked back at Omar's work in particular, there are a few historical precursors to it that I think it might be worth thinking about. That is, people who lived through events and were there, keeping diaries, keeping notes on things as they were happening, and especially on things that were actually inconceivable for people on the outside, that were impossible for them to understand or to believe were happening, which made so very important that the fact that these things were being recorded, and that they were being analyzed and packaged in a way that people on the outside could later understand. So when I was starting out as a journalist, I was in Cambodia, and there were stories that came out during the Khmer Rouge. There was a priest named Francois Ponchot who was in Cambodia as it fell to the Khmer Rouge, was there walking the streets when very few other foreigners were, who was able to describe what he saw. During the Nazi era in Germany, so we've got Ponchot, we've got Klemper, and I think Omar, his work sits in that tradition, should be understood that way. One difference is that Nazi Germany was decisively destroyed. It was a much more centralized state than the Islamic State has turned out to be. And the Khmer Rouge also centralized, and they were if not immediately destroyed, they were reduced to a kind of pathetic rump element in a malarial swamp. Whereas the Islamic State is still surviving in a very real sense, both where it began and in peripheral areas where it's making headway to this day. So the lessons of misgovernment, the dynamics of dictatorship, some of the themes of just episode 1, and then themes that I'm sure will be coming up, the mixture of religion and politics. These are applying to places far beyond Mosul, and the story matters a great deal. And I don't think anybody's better poised to tell it than the 3 storytellers we have here and the experts they bring, and in particular Omar. And then at the same time, you know, we mentioned that there are reasons for optimism. Some of those reasons for optimism are in the same way. So while the Islamic State survives in some form, Mosul survives too. And you know, Omar was at Yale as a visiting fellow with us for a short time, and you spend any time in his company, and you can understand the profound love of his native city, the very fact of his existence, and of his eagerness to watch the city be revived to something greater than it's ever been in his lifetime, is infectious, and that more than anything else is a cause for optimism. So I commend all of you for your work, and to anybody who's listening here, I really hope that you go immediately to download episode 1 of this podcast, and then order Omar suggests, listen to the episodes, re-listen to them, and learn about what you've missed. It should be guidance for not just how we understand Iraq, but many other places too. So congratulations, and get to downloading everybody.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Graham. Really appreciate your participation on this panel. And with that, we're going to close today's event. Thank you to everyone who has attended today. Of course, to Graham and Omar. Thank you to Lorenzo, Seamus, to Professor Zina, Kareem, and to our guests who appeared via video, Mr. Kareem Khan, QC, and General David Petraeus. Thank you all again. Please listen to Graham, subscribe. We really appreciate it, and we look forward to releasing the next episodes in the coming weeks. So thank you again to everybody.